Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 advisory group. Rev 250 is a collaboration among 70 organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the history of the American Revolution. And our guest today is Salina Baker, who is a novelist, a writer, now based in Texas. Salina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And Salina has written a 4-volume series called Angels and Patriots, which is an interesting take on the revolution. I'll maybe let you tell us a little bit more about it as we go on. And you've also written a prequel to it, What Happened Before. And now you are immersed in doing a biography. It's a fictional biography, I believe, of General Nathanael Greene.
Yes, historical fiction. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. The Line of Splendor, a novel
Yes.
of Nathanael Greene and the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's understandable, having done this deep study of the revolution, that Greene would be a character you would come back to for a standalone book. So what is it you find compelling about the story of Nathanael Greene?
I think it was his roots, like a lot of the men during the revolution and women. He came from average America. His father was a Quaker. He had a lot of brothers. He did a lot of manual work. They owned farms, ships, iron forges, and he actually worked in the iron forge by pounding smelt into anchors. And his father didn't believe in book learning beyond math, English, reading and writing.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was forbidden to read other literary volumes. But he went ahead and did it anyway. So right there, he was already kind of rebellious young man, going against his father. And so I could see him growing from this young man who decided that he needed to step forward into the world. And he wasn't a huge radical. He was irritated because the British confiscated his ship, the Fortune, for not paying levy taxes at port taxes. So that kind of is what ejected him into the revolution. And I just saw him grow as a general, as a husband and a father. And I was impressed with how no matter how he made mistakes, how many mistakes he made, how sensitive he was to criticism, he just kept going forward. And he earned Washington's trust. And I could just see him growing as a man. And that was my first attraction to him.
Interesting. And he is a rebel against his father, but also he's a Quaker. So how, as a Quaker, does he wind up being an officer in the Continental Army?
He did some things that were against the Quaker Society. He went to plays. He did some things with his cousin Griffin that the Quaker Society accused them that were improper, which they had just like either gone to a tavern or gone to a military parade. It was one of the two. It wasn't something horrible. So they were put on the spot by the Quaker Society and said, what are you guys doing? And Nathaniel and his cousin Griffin refused to talk to them and refused to tell them. And they were ousted out of the meetings. They weren't ousted out of the society, but the meetings. And he just eventually just moved away from them. And he didn't want to formally participate with the Quakers anymore.
Does he get involved in any other religious organizations that you know of?
Not that I know of. His wife, Katie, was not religious either. She grew up on the isolated island of Block Island off the coast of Rhode Island, and they didn't really observe religion there either. So he still talked about providence and God in his letters and things, but nothing formal.
That was one of the striking things about his letters is how much he does talk about things. I mean, he gives such a great window into not only the period, but his mind, his relationship with his wife, with other people. That's tremendous.
Very much.
Yeah. So What can you tell us about Katie, Catherine, his wife? She's from Block Island, and
She was from Block Island. She was 13 years younger than him. He was in love with some other woman, and she just finally jilted him and said, I don't want to marry you.
wow.
He already knew Katie through his distant relative, William Greene. William Greene's wife was raising Katie. Katie's mother was dead. So Nathaniel would go to visit William Greene, and Katie would be there. And she's, this young, vivacious girl. They fall in love. They get married. He leaves her and goes off to the siege of Boston. She's pregnant.
Wow.
And that begins her many years, like many of the wives, being alone without her husband. But she goes to the winter cantonments, and she's very convivial. She's smart. She's beautiful. The women are jealous of her, except for Martha Washington and Lucy Knox, not kind of maybe. But she was ended up being one heck of a woman after he died. The things that she did. She was involved in the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Her and her second husband.
Wow. How did that come about? And what's she doing down in Georgia or South Carolina after the Revolution?
Well, when Nathanael Greene was, I don't know, I'm kind of like jumping now, but Nathaniel, of course, fought with Washington in the North. The Revolutionary Wars, the British and the English Parliament's eyes kind of turned down to the South, and they started going down there. They took Savannah, they took Charleston, they took Wilmington, North Carolina, and Washington sent Nathanael Greene down there in December 1780 after a series of failures, of American general failures, to take over. Congress said, you choose this time. He chose Nathanael Greene. Nathanael Greene went and he chased the British basically out of the South. And so Georgia gave him a plantation, and so did South Carolina.
Well, so
he ended up moving down there because he was in terrible debt, and he was trying to recover from the war.
Yeah. It's really striking that at the end of the war, there are only 3 general officers who had been there since the siege of Boston, and they're Washington, Knox, and Greene.
Yes.
And so he had, left Rhode Island, and then for 8 years been part of this effort where he's really not getting paid.
No. Well, he got paid a little when he was quartermaster.
Right. Yeah. How many children do they have by the end of the war?
They had 5 surviving children.
Wow. And so would the children also have been in the camps when they were at these various winter camps?
That's a good question. I know Katie sometimes brought their oldest son, George Washington Greene, with her. I believe when she went through the other cantonments, she left the children with Nathaniel's brother, Jacob, or some of his family members. He would not let her come to the South, though, for the first couple of years.
Yeah.
Because everything was really bad down there.
Yeah. And that's a fortunate thing for us because he wrote to her a lot about what was happening in the South.
Yes.
No. So is George Washington Greene the baby she was pregnant with during the siege of Boston?
Yes. Wow. And unfortunately, he drowned in the Savannah River when he was 18.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
He went to Europe to school and under the care of the Marquis de Lafayette. And he came home, and I don't know how long it was afterwards that he drowned, but it wasn't that long afterwards. And he was buried with Nathanael Greene in Colonial Cemetery in Savannah. So I was going to say his body got moved, but that's a whole. I won't go into all of that. But
okay, so yeah, and you told me you were working on the book now. We're talking with Salina Baker, who has written a number of novels about the Revolution, and right now she's working on The Line of Splendor, a novel of Nathanael Greene and the American Revolution. You told me you're working on the draft where you're all in 1786. I don't want to give away how.
No, it's okay. But, General Greene's on the wall behind me over. I don't know if you guys can see him.
I see him. yeah. Looking over your shoulder as you
Yes,
write.
yes.
Uh, so, how you must get really invested in these characters as you're really trying to imagine their inner thought, their inner lives, really, as you're doing a novel. So it's not simply this happened, then this happened,
Yes.
history. Really recreating a mental world for Nathaniel and Katie and their children and the other people. So, what have you changed your perception of him since you really began this deep dive into Nathanael Greene's life and times?
I don't think I have. I think I was pretty enamored with him from the beginning in my Angels and Patriots series.
Yeah.
But I have found things that I had no idea. I found his will. He had written a will in October 1785. Just the things that I had discovered just by digging around. It's not all in the books. It's just,
Right.
fascinates me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's maybe the difference between writing fiction and writing history is you can pursue what in each case we can pursue what fascinates us, but you really need to know more to write a novel. You have to be able to recreate what someone was thinking, and
Yes,
from
and what they were
imperfect
saying.
sources. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The conversation part of it. Yes, yes.
Yeah. 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 So you're not just making it up. You have to have some root in what was plausible, I think.
That's a good question, and I have read as much as I possibly can about his letters, and so I
Mm-hmm.
can when he's writing his letters, he's writing to someone,
Right.
and that person might be close to him, or they can talk to one another. Another thing I've done is I have read obsessive amounts of biographies of the people that he was with.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Katie, Otho
Mm-hmm.
Holland Williams, Washington, Henry Knox, because I can't understand how the people he interacted with thought unless I read about them too.
Right. So how did
So,
no, go on.
no, go ahead.
How did the people did he have any enemies, say, in the Continental Army? You and I think he's great. Was there anyone who thought, boy, we're not as fond of him as we should be? As it
He was criticized horribly by a lot of people. Charles Lee, who was actually his commander, during the siege of Boston and after Washington arrived, criticized him horribly because
really,
Greene told Washington that Fort Lee and Fort Washington were defensible.
mm-hmm.
Greene had command of Fort Lee and Fort Washington. They fell.
Yes,
Lee was horrible to him. They were all
mm-hmm.
horrible to him.
Mm-hmm.
But Washington supported him and kept him in the fold.
Mm-hmm.
When he was in the South, he was criticized harshly for sticking his nose in civil authority,
Mm-hmm.
for bossing the militia around. One of the militia
Mm-hmm.
guys, Tom Sumter, hated him,
Really,
and he was super uncooperative. And some people called him a little dictator when he was in the South.
called Greene the Little Dictator.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
But he went down there to do a job, and he was gonna
Mm-hmm.
drop dead before he didn't get that job done.
Mm-hmm.
He
Yeah,
had
one
his
thing you.
faults, oh, for sure.
Oh, sure. So, what were some of not that we're going to dwell on his faults, but what were some of his faults?
He was sensitive to criticism, and
Mm-hmm.
and this is just my opinion. I'm not, I don't know what he was thinking, but he had a limp, he had asthma, and he had a smallpox scar on his right eyeball, and so his eyes were infected a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And when in 1774 he joined a militia company in Rhode Island, and they flat out said, "You cannot be an officer because you limp," and they said it publicly.
Wow.
So
Wow.
he was really sensitive to criticism.
Mm-hmm.
He could be irreverent.
Mm-hmm.
He was pushy.
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of we all do. He's a
Sure.
man.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. It's good to know. And you mentioned earlier that you saw in him this capacity for growth and then learning from mistakes. And he does make some big ones like Fort Lee and Fort
Mm-hmm.
Washington always a big one. And then he sometimes does come down with an illness at an inopportune time, like during the Battle of Long Island.
Yes.
But what is it that makes, how does he first meet Washington, and what makes Washington such a strong supporter of Greene throughout their time together?
That's a question I've been asked before, and I don't have a good answer for it. There's something Washington saw in Greene, maybe because he tried hard. He was dedicated to the cause of freedom. He swore he'd give his life. He continually produced. He kept his camp clean. He wanted to please Washington because that's his new mentor.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really exactly sure what Washington saw in him, except for this young man who was enthusiastic and a strong leader, a businessman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you make the point that he was very young. He was the youngest of the general officers at
Yes.
of the war. And does his father ever come around and say maybe, book learning wasn't such a bad thing? Or?
His father died in 1770, so.
Okay, so he's not part of any of this.
No, Nathaniel's brothers his brother Jacob kind of was involved, but yeah, his dad was dead.
Yeah. And Greene isn't really happy when Washington keeps putting him in charge of things that are difficult, and one is being quartermaster, which is something he really doesn't like being, but he's very good at it.
Yes, and he hated it.
Yeah.
He hated being chained to a desk. He argued with Congress constantly. It was a constant battle. Of course, Congress didn't have money.
Mm-hmm.
They were disorganized. They would take his deputies away from him. They would reorganize the department. And then suddenly he wouldn't have the same guys working with him anymore. And he's like, I need these guys. I can't do my job without deputies, commissaries. They won't listen to him. And but he was an excellent quartermaster anyway. Just like everything he did, he put 100% of himself into this job.
Yeah. And then he also presides over over the John Andre trial after the Benedict Arnold treason. So then people seem to have mixed feelings about having to execute Andre as a spy when they really wanted to get Arnold. And it must have been a difficult thing to be sitting in judgment on Benedict Arnold, who had been one of their real pillars before. Can you tell us a little bit about Greene's role in that affair?
There's not a whole lot of in-depth information that I can find. That doesn't mean there isn't.
Yeah.
Greene was very disappointed in Arnold. I do not know how sympathetic he was toward Andre, because I know some of the officers were.
Yeah.
I think Greene just saw it as doing his job. So that I can't really answer exactly what he thought about Andre himself.
It's one of the really tantalizing things about this, because he is someone who is the way you're describing him kind of in two ways. One is as someone who's very good at his job, and then someone who also has this side that you see, which is really interesting, and he reveals a lot to himself, as you were saying, to people he knows, like his wife. His letters to her are different than his letters, say, to perhaps Washington.
Are you asking me if they were different, if they seemed different, like how he talked to Katie versus how he talked to Washington?
Yeah.
Yes, he talked to Katie more like a husband. They had, like, his best friend, like she was his best friend. And he poured his heart out to everyone, even Washington. So maybe they were very similar now that I'm talking to you about it and thinking about it in those terms. Because he, for instance, when he resigned as quartermaster general, he told the Continental Congress in a letter, that made them extremely mad, that, and he literally wrote this, "You have hurt my feelings."
Wow.
And he would write something like that to Katie as well and be real, "I'm sorry if I upset you," whatever. But he would upset people when he wrote because he was kind of
Mm-hmm.
forward. And then he
Right.
would have to back off a little bit and say, "Oh, I'm sorry.
Hmm. Why do you think that is? I mean, why? He is very upfront, but B, he also is, as you said, sensitive to criticism. I mean, I realize you're a novelist and not a psychiatrist, but I'm just wondering if you've given any thought, if you can have any insight into that part of his character.
Yeah, just like I said before, I think it's because he had physical challenges, a limp, um, asthma, smallpox scar in his right eye,
Mm-hmm.
that he was criticized for his limp. I think also, too, maybe his lack of formal education may have had something to do with that. Of course, Washington didn't have one either,
Right.
and neither did Henry
Right.
Knox, but
Yeah.
it may have had something to do with that as well.
Yeah. And Charles Lee isn't someone who comes across very well in the long scheme of things. When you say Charles Lee didn't like him, it's really not a harsh criticism. I would be worse, I suppose, if Charles Lee really was a big supporter.
Well,
Um,
at first, Charles Lee and Greene got along fine,
okay.
but it was once Greene made a mistake, then Charles Lee
Mm,
came in like a bulldog and
mm,
attacked him really. He even attacked the whole Rhode Island regiments
mm.
and said they were worthless, and it was a bad attack.
Oh yeah.
So
Wow.
at first they got along fine.
Oh yeah. Wow. Wow. It's interesting. We're talking with Salina Baker, who is writing The Line of Splendor, a novel of Nathanael Greene and the American Revolution. And she's also written a 4-volume series, Angels and Patriots, which is a fascinating look at the revolution with you have the characters like Greene and Washington, but also you have angels and demons playing a
Hmm.
role. I mean, I should have mentioned that you also have an interest in supernatural and in fantasy fiction, and so it's really here is this period that we know a lot about, but you have injected a whole new way of looking at it. So, how did it come to you to do a fantasy series on the American Revolution?
My first two books are historical fantasy, and they
Mm-hmm.
were set in Victorian America. And after I wrote the second one, I thought I'd like to continue historical fantasy, but what could I write about?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what do I know something about, and what do I want to learn more about? Because this is also a learning experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
And the American Revolution, I realized I knew enough about it that I could get started with a series. And
Mm-hmm.
I started with the Sons of Liberty because I knew something about them. And so I needed to inject fantasy in there, and fallen angels came to me. It's not an unusual thing. People write about them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They came to Earth. They were in a war with God's demons because they had disobeyed. They believed that what they had done was affecting the Americans in the colonies because they knew some of the demons were British or in Britain. Now there was no war. It was December 1774 when the angels started realizing this was happening. They went to Boston. They met the Sons of Liberty. They said, "We might have brought this down on you."
Mm-hmm.
They didn't believe in killing the children of man, whether they were British or English, I'm sorry, or American,
Mm-hmm.
but they sided with the Patriots.
Hmm. But
And the series just grew all the way from there, all the way through the surrender of Yorktown.
mhm, mhm. And did you initially see this as a 4-volume series? Or were you thinking?
No, initially I thought it was going to be a standalone, but the first
Mhm.
book ends right after Bunker Hill. And I was like, I'm not done. There's this
Ah,
whole
okay.
war we can fight, and the angels are fighting their own war. And
Hmm.
and the Patriots are coming in and saying, we're okay with that.
Hmm.
And it just I was learning things. It was a huge learning experience because the series is historically authentic, accurate, but of course it has the supernatural elements in
Right.
that interaction as well. But the amount I learned just writing this series was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lot of fun too.
I'll bet. Now, you must have been a reader of fantasy, supernatural fiction during your pre-novelist years. You spent about 25 years as a software writer and doing the computer world. So would this have been something you would have done to relieve your mind from the technical aspects of doing software?
That's a good question. I never thought of it that way. It could be. It's a
Okay.
possibility.
Okay. And so you're now do the angels and demons appear in the Greene novel, or is that going to be just straightforward?
This is not going to be. It's just going to be straight historical fiction. The Line of Splendor.
Yeah.
No angels, no fantasy.
Okay.
Angels and Patriots is an adult series, where the novel about Greene is going to be more, PG.
Okay. Oh, good.
Because
I think there's a
I
real.
felt that I wanted to be more respectful if it was just about him.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I wasn't respectful. I was in Angels and Patriots, but just take the fantasy part out.
Right. That's interesting. And so, do you, as you're writing this, the Angels and Patriots, I'm really just curious about where you, as the novelist, draw a line between, the fantasy side of it and the kind of straightforward history side of it, or are they so intertwined that one wouldn't work without the other?
No, I'm actually with this novel about Nathanael Greene. I'm trying to move a little more. I am moving more toward historical fiction and kind of away from the fantasy, at least for now.
Yeah.
Since the first two books are also historical fantasy, I thought I probably had done enough with that.
Okay. Good. Greene, I mean, he is such an interesting character. It's almost a shame that Lin-Manuel Miranda didn't read your book before he read the book about Hamilton, because his life would make for, I think, a great musical. Great story.
I think so too. And his life is the American Revolution, basically.
Yeah.
What happened to him at the end was tragic. Yeah, he's a unknown, unsung hero that people should really know more about.
They should. Of course, he's remembered in places like, well, in Rhode Island, certainly, and then in the Carolinas, where there are places named for him. I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but you mentioned that his ending is tragic. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Without giving away the end of the book.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we'll know he does die in the end.
Yes.
But,
he fell into horrible debt trying to pay for his soldiers' uniforms and provisions in South Carolina when the war was after Yorktown. And of course, the war wasn't over. He still had an army to take care of, and everything went wrong with this loan that he was trying to get. Just the Continental Congress gave him nothing. He had some bills from the other states, but they were worthless in South Carolina. So he put up his own signature, and he went into horrible debt. And so the tragedy of him desperately trying, and it's very complicated, and desperate trying to get out of his debt and all the things he's trying to do, and he's trying to protect his family, and he's embarrassed about what happened with his finances, and he gets no help. He borrows money, and just this man who sacrificed everything, especially in the South, and this is how it's going to end. It's a waste. It was a waste, and it was a shame. The only good thing was Katie stepped up to the plate after he died, and she was not going to let all that just go out the window and do nothing. So that was the bright spot. But that's after the book is over, the novel is over.
Right.
So
You could do another book about her. She is
I thought about that too.
yeah, she is a fascinating character. As you said, George and Martha are taken with her. Other of the officers' wives are jealous, but then she does have an interesting life after Nathaniel's death. She marries again, um, and as you said, she's involved. Eli Whitney comes down, and she's involved with the cotton gin, and she's a Rhode Island woman who comes to Georgia and stays there.
Yes, and that's a good point. She was used to parties and
Mm-hmm.
dressing up, and the Newport Society or the
Mm-hmm.
Winter Cantonments or
Mm-hmm.
Philadelphia,
Yeah.
and she goes to Savannah. Excuse me, and it's just not happening down there like
No.
that. But now she's more mature,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow she found her way without a man holding her hand. And when she married Phineas Miller, it was under a prenuptial agreement.
Hmm.
So they had land in Savannah, South Carolina, and Cumberland Island, Georgia, and some other various places up north. So there was quite a bit of land. They were land rich, but cash poor.
Mm-hmm. So who was Phineas Miller?
Phineas Miller was Nathaniel hired a tutor for the children right before they went to Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
Katie was pregnant, and he needed someone to teach them because she was overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
So Phineas Miller was a Yale graduate, very young man, went with them to Savannah. And when Nathaniel died, Phineas stayed with them.
Mm-hmm.
So she and Phineas married about 6 or 8 years later. He was 10 years younger than her. And
Wow.
just around that time, Eli Whitney came down from Yale to tutor
Mm-hmm.
her neighbor's children.
Mm-hmm.
So they both, Phineas and Katie, knew him. And
Mm-hmm.
they both chipped in on financing that cotton gin. And actually, Eli Whitney fell in love with Katie Greene as well. But
Wow.
that relationship never happened. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it never came to fruition.
Mm-hmm. So, unlike his father, Nathaniel Greene did believe in education for his children.
Yes, and in fact, he left that in his will, what he expected to be done to educate them and the children. And like I said, he sent his son, well, he didn't send him because he's dead by then, but he made arrangements to send his son George to France to
Mm-hmm.
to be educated as well.
Right. Yeah. So Lafayette takes George back to France or oversees his education.
Yes, yes,
And then I know it's well beyond where you're writing, but Lafayette does visit with Katie when he comes back to America in the
yes.
1820s.
Oh, yeah, did he? No,
I
she
believe he
was
did.
dead by then.
Okay, but he does stop, and I think he might have visited.
Yes, you're right. It was the 1784 tour he did.
Right.
He went
Yeah.
back, came back. They gave him a tour of Rhode Island. So that was
Mm-hmm.
before Nathaniel died, but Katie died in 1814.
Okay. Interesting. So we were talking with Salina Baker, who is the author of Angels and Patriots, 4 books on the Revolution, and she is working on The Line of Splendor, a novel of Nathanael Greene and the American Revolution. And not to put any pressure on you, but when do you think we'll be seeing the book in the bookstores and on Amazon and on your website?
Yeah, I'm trying to be patient with myself to make sure it's all. I'm hopefully in the next year and a half.
Good, good,
Shouldn't
very
be too
good.
long.
Yeah. And are there things you wish you knew about Nathaniel and Katie that would, as you were writing this novel about them, are things you really wish you knew?
Wish I knew.
Yeah, like I wish that they had written down this, or is there, so you as the novelist would have a better time, or the reader would have a better time of understanding.
Yes. Katie burned her letters to Nathaniel.
Hmm.
He gave her a complex. He said that she was a bad speller
Wow.
and that she needed to watch her spelling. And he told her that quite often. And he was not a good speller either. So I
Huh.
don't know where he was coming with that.
Hmm.
But yeah, she burned her letters. Most of the things they know in her biography are from his responding to her letters.
Wow.
The letters after that, she liked to Eli Whitney and Alexander Hamilton, who was helping her, or someone like that.
Hmm.
Those letters I have been able to find those.
Hmm.
So I wish that she had not done that. I think it would have made for a whole richer feeling
Oh
of their
yeah.
relationship. But
Hmm.
Martha Washington did a similar thing with her
Right.
letters.
Yes. Wow. Fascinating. So we've been talking with Salina Baker. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thank you,
Salina.
Bob. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Yes, and we'll let you get back to the book. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our listeners who have been good with questions and suggestions. And every week I thank folks in different places. So we have regular listeners in we'll do some capitals today: Edinburgh, Washington, D.C., Bangkok, Madrid. Thank you all for joining us, as well as our listeners in Piscataway, New Jersey, and all places in between. So now Jonathan will have us piped out on the road to Boston.
Thank you.
Thank you.